Rabbi.
We got 3. Handle that. Rabbi.
Yes.
We got 3. Handle that. Rabbi.
Yes.
Mira, no me está enterando la bocina. No, digo que no me está enterando la bocina.
Jose?
Yes.
Shalom.
Shalom.
Shalom. I wasn't working for a while.
You what?
My thing wasn't. My Zoom wasn't working. I actually joined from the browser this time for the first time.
Ah, okay. Just a moment. Just need to switch glasses. There we go.
How many people do we have? Known to Tom.
Just a reminder, as we discussed previously, I promised that after we finished Eruvin, we would go through a discussion of how the modern Eruv system works. And thankfully, I found a very good summary of the topic, which will also allow you to review it at your leisure on Halachapedia, which is a very interesting website.
Can you please share with us the link, please?
I did, but I'll share it again. Maybe if you weren't already in chat, you didn't see it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sorry. Thank you.
No problem.
Good evening, by the way.
Good evening to you. So yes, the summary that I'm sharing is from the website Halachapedia, which is a good place to go for sort of a general view of halacha on a particular topic. It's not always easy to understand if you don't have 100% background. This article is very well written and brought together. A lot of the other articles are a bit more good summaries of different points, but don't always tie it all together if you don't know what you're looking at. But it is a nice resource that's out there. But as I mentioned, this topic of Eruv, we wanted to talk about the modern topic of how do we make an Eruv in the modern world. We don't live in little courtyards. We don't live in little alleys. So how do we apply the laws of Eruvin to a modern city? So that's what we're going to run through as we go through this document. Just give it another minute to see if anyone else logs in. Have a sip of my tea.
Are we on YouTube?
Yes.
Oh, I don't see the YouTube screen.
What do you mean?
There's usually a YouTube thing in the left corner of my screen that I don't see.
I don't know. I've only ever been up for my own programs. But I definitely hit stream, and last I saw it was, it still says it's streaming according to Zoom.
Oh.
All right, well, that's 7:05. I think that's good enough. Why don't we go ahead and get going? Just make sure my YouTube chat box is actually working. It looks like it's available, so I can double check over there. Oh, and Loretta says it is working, so yay! Technology is being a little better to me right now than it has been earlier in the day. All right, so making an Eruv. As we've talked about for quite a few weeks through Masechet Eruvin, the whole idea is to create a symbolically shared area that allows for carrying within that zone. As we're going to see, well, we talked about it in general, about the difference between what the Torah permitted and forbade, and what the rabbis added as for an additional forbidden level, and how the Eruv walks back the rabbinic prohibition, not the Torah prohibition. If you want a quick summary of that, you can either go to the very first class or the very last class, because in a beautiful flourish of editing, the final chapter of Eruvin and the final Mishnah of Eruvin reminds us that what is being given and permission here is really permission we already had from the Torah, but is being regulated through the rabbinic system. So that's going to be our first topic of how do we allow for an Eruv in the first place. And then once we know that, then we'll see how we can make it apply to a modern city. But I'm going to let Rabbi Schachter speak for himself. I will read and pause to explain and put my own commentary to what he is saying. But if you have questions, by all means, go ahead and raise your hand, pipe up. If you're on YouTube, go ahead and chat. I will be checking from time to time. If you see me turning my head to the left, it means I'm checking the YouTube screen, and hopefully we'll be able to get through this. It's not that complicated now that we've gotten through Eruv, but you'll notice some significant differences. And as you'll see, it's due in large part to how the topic of Eruv has been interpreted over the last 2,000 years, almost as though step by step it was preparing us for being able to make an Eruv in a modern city. Okay. In order to permit carrying from one domain to another, or within a public domain on Shabbat, a symbolic enclosure of an area, colloquially known as an Eruv, needs to be erected. That's what we've got so far as our basic understanding. In terms of halacha, there are 3 elements necessary to convert a public domain to a private one. The most significant one is the border enclosing the area, whether it is a house, neighborhood, or city, right? The other elements are a joint partnership between the tenants of the area in the ownership of some food, which usually takes the form of a box of matzah in the local synagogue. This is the way it's handled in the modern world. In the ancient world, of course, it would be perhaps in a different home within the courtyard. And a deed of rental of the area from the local government. So this is because of in the modern world, because of the notion of public property, there needs to be a formal agreement, even if from the local government's point of view, it's a symbolic agreement that allows for the area in which the border will be constructed to be officially rented to the people making that border, and an official umbrella usage of the area in between.
Rabbi, you really need the agreement. What happens if you are living in a government that the head choose or they don't want to collaborate with you, but you have enough population in a density in an area to create an Eruv? Can you do it without the permission from the government?
So, yeah. In the modern world, most of the places where Jews live, this is not a problem most of the time. However, this is a bit of an issue if the government is deliberately antagonistic to the Jewish people. What would usually happen in such cases is within a Jewish neighborhood where the neighborhood was heavily Jewish, you would be able to create an Eruv within the Jewish property that would allow for carrying in that zone. However, if the government was really going to be antagonistic about your construction, which we'll talk about later, then that would still be a problem. And sabotage of the Eruv was an ongoing concern. In the modern world, especially in America, you do get into some cases in certain areas where the local city council or petitions against the city council will be trying to prohibit the creation of an Eruv. Sometimes this is because there are people that are adamant that there should not be any intermingling of church and state, or synagogue and state in this case. So many groups will say, look, no accommodation should be made to any religious groups, and they're not singling out the Jewish groups at all. It's just they don't want any connection between state and religion. But you also do see some people, and this has happened in recent memory, I believe there was a case in Long Island, if I'm not mistaken. All of New York is a bit of a blur for my geography, I'm afraid, where an Orthodox community was expanding into a new area, and the people who lived in that area were fighting to prevent the construction of an Eruv in order to try and prevent more Orthodox from moving in. So that's a much more controversial blockage. They eventually did get permission to build the Eruv, but it is sometimes used as a pushback on the Haredization, the making of a new neighborhood to be Haredi. And that's a whole other conversation of why areas might want to prevent that. But the messing with an Eruv or trying to prevent the cooperation of the local government in allowing an Eruv is a common tactic. But it's not common overall, but this is one of the weak points that they can push on.
But you really, really need to have the permission from the government. You cannot go around without the permission.
You really, really need to have your rabbi make those decisions.
So there is an opening, okay, for creating a roof, and a roof, if the rabbi is on board, of course,
so,
with like avoiding the permission from the government.
All right, so the making of an Eruv as an architectural endeavor is something that is really only handled by a few experts in the country. Your local rabbi, whether they're Orthodox, conservative, or whatever, does not normally dare to say that the Eruv they are making is good for the city or good for even a neighborhood. They might make an Eruv between, for example, their house and the synagogue, if it's just like, a door over. They might make an Eruv if they have a Jewish camp during the summer. But most congregational rabbis won't touch making an Eruv with a 10-foot pole or even 10 amot pole, because whether people accept the Eruv or not is often a very political debate. And there are many people who refuse to accept an Eruv or the stipulations under which the Eruv was made. So even in an area where the Eruv was put together with full cooperation of everybody involved and a great rabbi who handled it all very clearly, there are always going to be some people who say, I don't hold by the Eruv. You can certainly find ways, like you say, to get a rabbi on board, but getting the people on board may be harder. So yeah, this is an area that is perhaps even more potentially controversial than kashrut, which has its own political elements too. All right, now continuing with Rabbi Schachter, the technical term Eruv as it appears in the Gemara in the Talmud refers to the food which the tenants jointly own. Colloquially, however, right, in common usage, it refers to the border of the enclosure, which is usually the most recognizable element of this legal mechanism, as well as the hardest to construct, right? Putting matzah in a box is easy, having a symbolic joint ownership is easy, building the actual Eruv, that's the tricky part as a physical act. So he's just reminding us, the Eruv in the Gemara is talking about the food, but when people talk about it in their community, usually they mean the border. In its ideal form, right, this is what we've seen in our Mishnah, the borders of an Eruv would be solid walls, right? If we could dream of having a huge wall, like the Wall of Jerusalem or the Great Wall of China, going all the way around Orlando, right? That would be the simplest, clearest, easiest way to imagine building an Eruv in Orlando. Of course, he continues, considering that this possibility is highly impractical in modern society, another approach needs to be investigated. For much of Jewish history, cities were usually walled. Sometimes even small cities would have a little wooden stockade, a little wooden like fort around the outside. So it wasn't that hard to build an Eruv with that in mind. And then we also know, of course, in many areas of Europe, Jews lived in ghettos that also had walls that were built around them by the non-Jews to keep us in. And that, ironically, also made an Eruv easy. In the modern world, doesn't work so easily. We don't have all that many city walls anymore. The Gemara introduced, because this was an issue in the ancient world too, the the concept of using surat hapetach, right? The shape of a doorway, a symbolic doorway, as a wall. According to the Gemara, the construction of a doorway requires two doorposts and a lintel sitting atop the doorposts. Whereas the doorposts have certain requisite measurements, we've talked about how many handbreadths they need to be sticking out. The lintel on top can be as thin as wire or string. Right? We'll come back to this a little bit later, but that is the conclusion of both the Mishnah as well as the Gemara in more detail. By lining up a number of surat hapetach, of these symbolic doorways made of these doorposts and lintels, it becomes feasible to erect a complete enclosure of a large city. Even though using surat hapetach, the symbolic doorways, may be the only practical option in order to construct an eruv, there is one significant caveat to this approach. Right? We're going to have to work through why we're allowed to do this and why it is considered to be technically okay. But just in your mind, what you need to be visualizing in any modern eruv is that you are not surrounded by a wire or a string or a stick that goes around you. You're actually surrounded by a wall that just happens to have lots of big openings in it. Right? That's what you should be sort of imagining in your mind. How we get to have those openings be allowed, how we get to have this structure work, that's what we're going to go into in more detail. But everyone got that basic structure? Okay. The explanations of surat hapetach enclosure, this version. Let's go back to the Torah. From a biblical perspective, meaning D'Oraita, in the Torah, there are two well-defined types of domain. Reshut hayachid, the private domain, my house, and Reshut harabim, a public domain, right? Not my house, but it's going to be a little bit trickier than just saying exactly what that is. Any other area is considered makom patur, an exempt area, meaning neither one nor the other. It is vanilla. It's the parav area, right? If you want to talk about it in terms of kashrut. The definition of a reshut hayachid is an area with a minimum measurement of 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, right? A tiny, tiny little area that is surrounded by walls 10 tefachim high, right? If you've got that, basically if you're standing in a large Amazon box with high walls, you are in a private domain. A reshut harabim, or anything bigger than that, I should point out, right? If you're standing in a house, you're in a reshut hayachid. You're in a private domain because your house has walls around it. If you are in a back garden that has a medium length wall all the way around it, that is a private domain. A reshut harabim, on the other hand, the public domain, is a street at least 16 amot wide. This is from the Gemara. Now, 16 amot is approximately, what would that be, 24 feet across, which is about, 8 meters across, right? That is a reshut harabim. An open field then, which is neither an enclosed nor used by the public, is considered a makom patur on a biblical level. So carrying from my house out the back door into the field, technically according to the Torah, I am not violating Shabbat, right? Because that is not a reshut harabim. It is just a wide natural field. Walking through my front door onto the street that is at least 24 feet across, right, 8 meters, now that is a public domain, and therefore it would be prohibited. The biblical prohibition, he continues, of carrying an item from one domain to another only applies to a reshut hayachid to a reshut harabim, or vice versa. Carrying between a makom patur and a reshut harabim, or between a makom patur and a reshut hayachid, would be permitted on a biblical level. Right? That was what we were talking about different times throughout our section on Eruvin, that biblically the definition of transfer is very limited. However, to avoid inadvertent, accidental violations of Shabbat, the rabbis introduced a fourth type of domain called a karmelit. This category includes some areas that would be considered Reshut HaYachid on a biblical level, and some areas that would be considered a Makom Patur on a biblical level. Continuing with our example, while an open field is a biblical Makom Patur, on a rabbinic level it is a Carmelit. The rabbis forbade carrying from a Carmelit to a Reshut HaYachid or a Reshut HaRabim, and therefore, in effect, we treat a Carmelit like a public domain, a Reshut HaRabim, on a rabbinical level. All right, so now that we see that we have much greater permission according to the Torah to carry, but that the rabbis took it away by the invention of this domain of Carmelit, which they generally treat as though it were a public domain, what we're seeing then is how we walk back the Carmelit zone in order to allow carrying in that space. Although Orthodox Jews, and the rest of us who also take halacha seriously, generally observe rabbinic enactments with the same zeal as they would observe biblical commandments, right? We don't normally go around saying, oh, it's only from the rabbis, I don't have to do it. Of course, we treat all of the mitzvot, whether they are from the rabbis or from the Torah, as equally binding. The laws of Eruvin demonstrate an exception to that principle. Significant leniencies are based on the fact that many of its details are only rabbinic in nature. There is a general assumption among the poskim, the rabbinical authorities, that an enclosure created by several tzurat petach would not be sufficient to circumvent a biblical prohibition against carrying on a Shabbat. Only once the area can be determined to be a makom patur, an area for which carrying to a Reshut HaYachid or Reshut HaRabim entails a rabbinic and not biblical prohibition, can construction of an eruv using the tzurat petach ensue. In other words, tzurat petach, this idea of these large openings, is effective as long as one can be sure that the area is not a true Reshut HaRabim. There are two reasons offered for this assumption. So I just want to make sure you get the operative principle here. In order to create a modern mass area eruv by using this symbolic large opening space, you have to first define the space that's being enclosed as not being public domain, but instead as belonging to the rabbinic definition of a Carmelit. Even though normally a Carmelit has the same rules as a public domain, with regard to an eruv, there is much more leniency for enclosing a Carmelit than there is for enclosing a public domain. And therefore, it's going to be imperative, absolutely essential, that we find a way to define the modern city area we're enclosing as not really a Reshut HaRabim. Everyone with me so far? Okay. You can see, by the way, why I left this till the very end, because if we had begun with all of these concepts before we had gotten through the entire Mishnah, it would be absolutely hard. And even with the weeks of Mishnah study we've done, I'm sure this is still very confusing. Don't feel bad if you're going to want to go back to this website and review it, and feel free again to call or email me if you want more clarification when we're done. Come on, scroll down. All right. Rabbi Yosef Tomim, author of an important commentary on the Shulchan Aruch called Pri Megadim, raised the possibility that the tzurat petach is only effective in enclosing an area according to rabbinic law. According to biblical law, however, the tzurat petach is ineffective. Subsequently, using a tzurat petach to enclose an area that is considered to be a public domain on a biblical level would simply be inefficient to convert it into a private domain, to make it an eruv space. A Carmelit, however, is considered a makom patur on a biblical level and is only considered public by the rabbis. Thus, by erecting a rabbinically sanctioned enclosure, one may convert it into a private domain. What the rabbis took away, the rabbis can return. What the Torah took away, the rabbis cannot return. So it's important to make sure that the area that we are putting into general usage with an eruv is technically a Carmelit, is technically a makom patur. However, the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Abraham Karlitz, strongly disagreed with Pri Megadim's idea. He proved, in his opinion, from the Gemara that a tzurat petach functions as a wall on a biblical level. So he is what you would call more lenient with regards to what could become a wall. The Gemara states that in order to avoid kilayim, the separation, the prohibition on planting two different kinds of seeds together, one may construct a tzurat petach to divide between two patches of plants. Right? So you're building this symbolic wall between the two rows in your farm in order to symbolically separate them. Therefore, Rabbi Karlitz concluded that the construction of a tzurat petach serves as a wall even where the wall fulfills a biblical requirement. However, on the other side, in order to defend the Pri Megadim, some later authorities suggested that there is room to distinguish between the wall necessary to permit carrying on Shabbat and the wall necessary to separate the plants of different species. The walls in the realm of Kilayim serve merely as a divider between two areas, and as such, the Tzurat HaPetach accomplishes this task even on a biblical level. To permit carrying on Shabbat, however, the borders of a private domain need to encircle it and make it noticeably differentiated from its surroundings, meaning that biblically, to turn a public area into a private area, it has to be absolutely clear that you really do have a wall surrounding it. And the form of the wall, the Tzurat HaPetach, is not good enough on a biblical level. Now, this is a back and forth disagreement between poskim, and this is an ongoing debate when it comes to the modern world, which is one reason why people will accept or not accept different Eruvin. Another approach in explaining the basis for limiting the use of Tzurat HaPetach, enclosure to a Carmelite, emerges from a comment of Tosafot. The Tosafot were the medieval commentaries that have great prominence in the Talmud. The Gemara explains that all opinions agree that a flimsy barrier cannot serve as a partition if there is traffic that regularly crosses that barrier. But a sturdy barrier functions as a partition even if traffic passes through it. Tosafot commented that if an area is enclosed on three sides and only requires a wall on the fourth side on a rabbinic level, even if the fourth wall is flimsy and traffic passes through it, nonetheless it serves as a valid partition. The Maharam of Rothenburg extended the idea of the Tosafot to say that in any situation that only requires a wall on a rabbinic level in order to permit carrying, that wall could be flimsy and is nevertheless not nullified by the fact that traffic passes through it. So to summarize, based on the leniency of the Maharam, classical poskim assume that Tzurat HaPetach acts as a flimsy wall, because it's not really like a giant stone barrier, which
Flimsy is something temporal.
What?
Flimsy is something temporal.
Flimsy, yeah, it's not solid, it moves. So for example, a rope or a cable or a string has a lot of flexibility. Yes, Eric?
Rabbi, since it needs to be 10 whatever things high, if it was like an island, since it goes down more than 10 feet, would that work too? Like Manhattan would be an island?
No, so we're not really going to get into the question of physical barriers, but in general, we don't use just the edge of the river as being one of the walls unless there is a bank that comes up on the river. You may remember a little while ago we talked about lowering from a roof down into a well or a cistern that had a bank around the edge. That can make the edge okay if there is that kind of dike along the edge of the river, but just a bare desert island disappearing into the water, that doesn't work so well. That's why, yes, in certain parts of Manhattan, the waterfront is sufficient, and in other parts, it's not. Okay, so you're right. So classical poskim assume that it's okay if it's flimsy, if it functions as a partition, only if it's considered a public domain on a rabbinic level. Therefore, the consensus of poskim, if there is such a thing, but certainly the majority, is that Tzurat HaPetach only permits carrying in the enclosed area if the area would be otherwise only a biblical makom patur. Okay, so it's a very long way of saying, to build a modern Eruv, we are only allowed to use that symbolic archway, doorway around the area if we can define the area inside of it as not technically a public domain. Now, again, this is a technical term. We are not talking about whether it feels like public property or not. We're not talking about whether the state calls it public property or not. We are talking about the definition according to Jewish law of whether it is public property or not. And that's what the next section is going to deal with. Is how do we know what is public domain and not public domain? Because as you can see, for most of the poskim, that's what this is all going to hinge on. Yes, there is a minority that says you can use the symbolic border even around a public domain that would be considered public domain by the Torah, but most authorities do not go down that road. So we really want to come up with a way to define the area in our cities as not technically Reshut Harabim, the public domain. So we are now going to do some mental gymnastics to make sure it will not be defined that way. How does one decide whether any given area is biblically considered a public domain, Reshut Harabim? The Gemara derived the 39 malachot, principal categories of labor, that are prohibited on Shabbat from the significant activities done in the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert. The Gemara implicitly assumed that the transportation of the Mishkan was also included in the mitzvah of constructing the Mishkan, right? You can't build it if you can't carry it. Therefore, since carrying it is part of building it, carrying is prohibited. Therefore, the details of the prohibition against carrying on Shabbat can be derived from how the Mishkan was transported in the desert. The wagons containing the parts of the Mishkan could only have traveled on streets with a minimum width of 16 amos, based upon the number of wagons and what was carried on them. Thus, in order for an area to be considered a public domain, it must include a street at least 16 amot wide. Right? Again, 24 feet, 25 feet. However, in practice, this definition doesn't help very much, since in almost all places where an eruv is desired, the streets are wider than 16 amot, or at least one or two of the main streets are at least that wide. In our own area, if you want to walk across the 436, the 1792, the 434, Maitland Boulevard, all of those streets are well over 16 amot wide. So if we wanted to build an eruv, it sounds like we'd be out of luck. But wait, we're not done. One of the potential considerations in determining whether a particular area is Reshut Harabim is the size of its population. All right, so in addition to the size of the street, we also need to talk about its population. Again, this criterion is based on the derivation of the laws of carrying on Shabbat from the transportation of the Mishkan in the desert. Rashi and the Tosafot wrote that just like there were 600,000 people in the Jewish camp in the desert, the definition of public domain for the purposes of the prohibition of carrying on Shabbat requires a minimum population of 600,000, which in their day was a pretty safe bet that none of their cities had 600,000 people. Now, there is a dispute, he points out, as to whom is included in the count of population when determining the status of the area. The opinions range between counting all residents, counting all people who roam the streets of the area, and counting just people who walk on a particular street, the actual traffic on that road.
But Rabbi, those 600,000 are Jews or could be also non-Jews?
No, it's as far as the Eruv goes, we're talking about total population, Jewish and non-Jewish.
Total population, but we learn in the Mishnah that non-Jews are not counted for Eruv. It's only Jews. So why you counted non-Jews for the 600,000?
Because we're counting whether or not that area, that road, is a public area, and whether that road is used by enough people is based upon the number of total people traveling that road, even if they're not Jewish. It's just, the foot traffic of the area is all that matters, not whose feet they are. It's like if I were to ask you, is Maitland Boulevard a busy street? You wouldn't say, well, do you mean by Jews or non-Jews? A busy street is a busy street. And if I say be careful on a busy street, you wouldn't say, oh, there's only like 5 Jews in the area, this street's not busy, and then walk across without checking. You'd say, whoa, how many people are actually using the road? And that's why they're using that definition. However, there is an argument about whether or not the actual number is the area of the people within the area of the Eruv, or the people who actually are using that street in total, or whether it's just the people who use that 16 Amot street that is the problem that you have to circumvent. So that was an argument. He continues, based on this assumption, many communities in Eastern Europe relied on a local Eruv, considering their small villages and towns to be a makom patur and not a public domain on a biblical level. Until very recently, and even still, there aren't that many places that have even 600,000 people in the town, let alone 600,000 people using one street every day. So for most of those communities, they were safe putting up an Eruv because they could define their city, their town, as not being a public domain because of the population being low enough. Just a second, Aaron, you had your hand up?
Yes, Rabbi. In one of the previous Mishnahs, didn't we learn that when counting people for the Eruv, they counted the people who were staying there on Shabbat and not the people coming in and out of the city?
We did, yes. Well, we didn't run a question of counting them. It was a question of whether they could use the Eruv and whether they would potentially mess up the Eruv by coming in.
So should that be the same standard for counting the 600,000?
Nope, because again, we're not talking about who's going to use the Eruv. We're talking about whether or not the population makes the area a public domain. It's a different consideration. Remember, all of this calculation is before you have begun to make an Eruv. You're just checking to see whether it's an area that could have an Eruv. So if you had, for example, according to most authorities, an area with a 25-foot wide road, and there were 600,000 people marching up and down it every day, most authorities would say, so far, you're out of luck. You just can't make an Eruv the way we make a modern Eruv, by stretching a wire around it to build the shape of a border. It's just that is a biblical public area. So this is all the preliminary analysis before you even begin construction.
Where did okay.
Go ahead.
Where'd that number 600,000 come from?
Because that is the rough estimate of the census when we were leaving Egypt.
All right.
So if our camp in the desert was about 600,000 people, although technically we only counted the military-aged men, but if the area was that we could count was 600,000 people, then that becomes their definition, because that was the area that they couldn't carry the Mishkan pieces in. Remember, all of this is meant to be derived from how the Mishkan was built. If they said you couldn't carry the pieces of the Mishkan, then the area that you needed to carry it and the population of the area in which you were carrying it must have been important. And therefore, they are using those two definitions to try and define a public area. But you will notice, and this is part of the, I hate the word, the liberalism of the rabbis, right? The non-hyper-literalism of the rabbis, the thing that makes them different than the Karaites, for example, is they are coming up with definitions all the way back in the Gemara, before we even had cities the size that we do now, with definitions that are going to make it much easier to build an Eruv. Right? If they had just said a public domain is any area that any person has the right to walk on, we'd all be out of luck. Because that would make almost the entire world Reshut HaRabim, public domain. And that would make it almost impossible to put an Eruv anywhere that didn't involve full stone or wood city walls. So it's very much to their credit that they had the foresight to come up with this derivation, legitimately based within the text itself, that ends up allowing for more opportunities to carry than you might otherwise think. Natan, you also had a question?
No.
Okay. Ramban explained that the opinion of the Tosafot, which required a minimum population of 600,000, is limited to streets within a city. For a local street within the city to be considered public, it requires a certain level of usage. In contrast, a highway from one city to another, wrote Ramban, is automatically considered a public domain even without any minimum population, simply by its definition as a major public road. So this is a point of argument. It is possible to suggest that Rambam actually defined the biblical Reshut HaRabim as a highway, and he viewed all the guidelines about determining whether a given area is a Reshut HaRabim as a test of whether it is sufficiently similar to a highway or not. So even with Ramban's very stringent definition regarding highways being automatically Reshut HaRabim, there are those who read him the opposite way and say everything but a highway can be considered a Reshut, a Makom Patur, and therefore Carmelit, and therefore we can make an Eruv around it. But this is one reason why you don't see Eruvin crossing highways, right? An Eruv will go around the edges of highways, not over it. Some rabbis felt that this approach of Rashi and the Tosafot in defining a public domain as well accepted and served as a basis for the modern Eruv, right? And that's what we are going to talk about. However, he is very thorough and gives us the other opinions. Others argued that many Rishonim, the medieval rabbinic authorities, disregarded the idea of Rashi and Tosafot and assumed that there was no minimum population for an area to be considered a Reshut HaRabim. Therefore, other suggestions were offered in order to explain the basis for local Eruvin in Eastern Europe. The Aruch HaShulchan interpreted a passage in the Yerushalmi to mean that a public domain is defined as a street that is known to be the main street of the town. If there are multiple streets, main streets in the town, however, no one of them can be identified as Reshut HaRabim. Accordingly, the larger the city, the more likely it would be for a multiplicity of streets to cause there to be no particular main street. Ba-ding! Right? This is a way to end up still with a no Reshut HaRabim, therefore means we can make a larger Eruv by saying the larger the city, the less likely there is to be a dominant street. Another question? I think there was some background topic. What? Hello? All right.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was Ilana here.
Oh, she wants to enjoy the study, she can. Yet the inference of the Aruch HaShulchan has traditionally been considered counterintuitive, to say the least, that the bigger the city, the less public the domain, and has not been accepted, at least not widely. I'm checking my time. Do we want to keep, you know what, we're going to skip the next two. Please read them on your own time. There are other discussions here about alternative ways. So let's go ahead and deal with the Chazon Ish's model of a citywide Eruv, of how he looks at this in a way that allows for an Eruv in the modern world. All right, we'll get to the actual functional version. But the theoretical, it's very interesting. Read on your own time. The last major approach to explain how a large city could not be considered a biblical Reshut HaRabim was elucidated by the Chazon Ish. The Gemara establishes that a border which is made up of a number of walls with gaps between them can be considered one long wall if the combined length of its gaps is less than the combined length of the standing walls. Right? We've talked about this with breaches in the wall and other forms, that if you have a wall and there's a gap, and then wall, and then a gap, and wall, and then a gap. As long as the total amount of wall is more than the total amount of gap, it's considered to be a complete wall. And this is how you can have gates in the wall. This rule is limited to cases in which the gap is less than 10 amot in length, something that we've seen multiple times in the Mishnah. A wall with gaps greater than 10 amot is not considered to be an effective border, right? You can't even see that it's a gap. It just looks like there is no wall. While Mishkanot Yaakov interpreted this to mean that a wall which has gaps greater than 10 amot is not considered a wall even on a biblical level, the generally accepted view is that of the Beit Ephraim, who argued that this would be an effective border on a biblical level, and is only invalid rabbinically, meaning the Torah would still call it a wall with the gaps, but the rabbis made a stringency saying it's not. As we know, anything where the rabbis made a stringency, the rabbis can undo the stringency if you follow the proper procedure. Welcome to an Eruv. In major cities such as New York City, it is quite common to have buildings line both sides of the street without any gaps between the buildings, right? You just have giant walls of skyscrapers, creating a border of sorts. Even if each cross street creates a gap in the continuity of buildings, right? Building, 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 street, building, building, building. The majority of such a border would be standing walls and would only have a minority of gaps. Any street that has such buildings on both sides is considered to be enclosed by two walls on a biblical level, since the buildings form a wall with the majority standing. Lastly, if such a street comes to a dead end, where it is met by another wall of buildings, then it would be enclosed by three walls, which would make it a biblical reshut hayachid. All right, so let's take a look at the diagram before we go on. If you're looking over here on the right, can people see my mouse? Can you see my cursor? Yes? Okay. So what he's talking about is Street A, right? That's our main street that we're dealing with here. And you can see Street A has building, 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 side street, building, 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 side street, building, 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 side street, dead end by another wall of buildings. Well, this area, because the walls are more than the gaps, is basically one long wall as far as the Torah is considered. And this level, this wall, would also be one long wall as far as the Torah is considered, and they technically connect to this row. And since this is also a wall going sideways, you basically have a wall on all three sides, which is the basic of a reshut hayachid. And then it has an opening that would be the entryway at the other end. Boom, reshut hayachid. We don't need to do anything to make it more than that.
This is like an alleyway.
It's like an alleyway, but it's much bigger than we would think of as an alleyway. Okay.
So you can create the roof in that situation because it's like an alleyway and you can't transport on Shabbat things.
Yes, but wait, there's more. Right? We're going to use this very creatively to expand out rather than just limiting ourselves to Street A.
So what happens if you have a bigger entry on the side? Because I remember that in the WME, I think it was yesterday, they were talking about the same problem. So if you are treating this street as an alleyway, and what happens if you have a big street on one of the sides? Can that destroy the roof?
So it would if you don't do anything additionally, right? If you don't span any place where there is a wide opening, bigger than the 10 amot, then you're in trouble. But how you span that 10 amot, well, that's what we're going to get to when we talk about the Tzurat HaPetach. But in the situation like we see in the diagram, it's not an issue because the streets are not that huge. But yes, if there's big streets, then we would need to add a little something to cover the gap that's too big. But that we're going to get to in a minute. Before expanding this proposition, let us analyze one of our basic assumptions that the building that line the streets can serve as a wall for an eruv. He wants to prove this. The Gemara states that a mechitza, the partition, can serve as a wall for an eruv even if it was not originally intended to be used as an eruv wall when it was constructed. Right? If it was just the wall of a building and you never thought of it as an eruv wall, that's still okay. Therefore, the Chazon Ish presumed that the buildings which line the streets could serve as an eruv wall to the enclosed street. Rav Moshe Feinstein, however, found it difficult to view the walls as a partition that would enclose the street, since they were originally constructed for the purpose of enclosing the inner part of the building and never function as a border of the street. All right, so he argued against this, but nonetheless, the Gemara clearly seems to indicate that the Chazon Ish's position is correct. So Rav Moshe Feinstein loses this argument. because indeed it doesn't matter what their purpose was. If they serve the job of being wall-like for the area you want to enclose, that's good enough. With that in place, it is possible to take the Chazon Ish's approach one step further. All right, everybody ready? Hold on to your hats. He said, as long as it was possible to find one street that came to a dead end in the city, the rest of the city would be considered a Reshut Hayachid. What? According to his explanation, the street which comes to a dead end is considered a Reshut Hayachid since both of its sides are lined with buildings and one end comes to a dead end. In envisioning the sides of the street as walls, he can even view even the gaps in the buildings, the cross streets, as forming part of the wall, since the majority of the wall is standing. Now that the junctions between our original dead end and a dead end street and its cross streets are considered a border, the cross streets become dead ends as well, and each one would be considered a biblical Reshut Hayachid. By continuing to find the grazing cross streets from any of those previously determined private domains, it is possible for the entire city to be considered a Reshut Hayachid. It is noteworthy, however, that the last extension of Chazon Ish's approach is questionable and its correctness can be investigated further. So let me explain what he's talking about. Go back to our diagram. So street A, we just defined as being a wall that covers it on three sides. But that means that street B has walls on its two sides, and then it also hits the wall that is imagined as concluding street A. Right? So now street B is connected to a wall made up of the imaginary wall filling in the gap on street A. So now it has 1, 2, 3 sides, and so does street D, or C and D. And then if we had other streets over here, they would hit street B, and they would become their own private domain. So basically, the different streets would interlock, each one filling the gap of the streets to make its own wall, but therefore becoming the wall that allowed the other streets to be closed on three sides. And like dominoes, everything suddenly becomes filled in as a private domain, a Reshut Hayachid. Now that it's all a private domain, we can make an Eruv and share anywhere within that private domain. Magic. Okay. However, a lot of people want a little bit more than that. They want a little bit more structure to cover some of these gaps and to give that shape, especially when you get to areas that don't have buildings like this description here. And I know in Los Angeles, you don't get a lot of skyscrapers sitting side by side in the areas where people actually live. So there are still going to be big areas that need to be spanned in order to make the Eruv possible outside of the concrete jungles of places like Chicago and New York. So this is where we come back to the notion of Surat HaPetach. Now that we've established, maybe or maybe not to your satisfaction, that most major areas are not considered Reshut Harabim, public domain, but instead are considered to be Makom Patur, even though that means we treat them as a Carmelite under normal circumstances where we wouldn't carry. With an Eruv, we are not going against the biblical limit, we are merely pulling back where the rabbinic prohibition was if we allow ourselves to have this symbolic border around those other areas in places where we don't have the physical border of the wall of buildings. So what does that symbolic border look like? The basic idea of Surat HaPetach is that it resembles a door frame, which consists of 2 doorposts and a lintel on top, something we did a lot of in Eruvin. The doorposts need to be sturdy enough to support a lightweight door that would reasonably be used as a real door in that part of the world and whose width extends from one doorpost to the other, although it needs to only be 10 tefachim high. The farther the doorposts are from one another, the sturdier they have to be in order to support a door that would extend from one post to another. In actuality, however, very often the poles of modern Eruvin are too wobbly to realistically hold any door, calling into question the validity of these Eruvin. So this is where you get a lot of, again, politics and debate of whether the Eruv is a good enough Eruv, and why most, like I said, congregational rabbis are not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole. They want somebody whose reputation is at least more unimpeachable in this topic than theirs, and in order to try and get more buy-in. Because remember, the whole point of having an Eruv is to bring community together, not to divide people between those who accept it and those who don't. Regarding the lintel, the part that goes over the top of the door, the Shulchan Aruch followed the version of the Talmud Yerushalmi that allows the lintel to be as thin and weak as a string. The Meiri, however, had a version of the Yerushalmi that required the lintel to be strong enough to be able to bolt the door into it for further support. Until today, we follow the Shulchan Aruch and allow a string as the lintel. The Gemara established that the Tzurat HaPetach, which is poorly constructed in the eyes of a professional architect, is invalid, right? If your shape doesn't meet the basic criteria of an average architect, then it's not good enough. For example, the strength serving as a lintel must pass directly over the top of the doorposts and may not be tied around the sides of the doorposts. Otherwise, it's considered poorly constructed. The string has to actually be where the lintel would be in a real doorway. Similarly, if the doorposts do not touch the ground, remember these are the side posts, even if they are within 3 tefachim of it, the Chazon Ish considered it poorly constructed and therefore invalid. Although there is the concept of lavud, the principle that supposes that any two objects within 3 tefachim of one another are considered as though they were touching, the Chazon Ish felt that it may not be employed in the construction of a Tzurat HaPetach, since a non-Jewish architect would never use it, right? We may think a gap is okay, but the regular architects would say no. Another case in which the Tzurat HaPetach is invalid is where the doorposts are misaligned with the gap in the border that this Tzurat HaPetach would complete. For example, Tzurat HaPetach may not serve as a fourth wall of a boundary if its doorposts are to the left or right of where the fourth wall should be. See diagram 2. You can see the anchor points are too far apart from where they should be, which is at the edge of the other walls. Additionally, if the doorpost for Tzurat HaPetach is inside a separate Reshut HaYachid, the door frame is invalid. This situation is possible when one of the doorposts is found inside of a fenced area, right? So let's say you're trying to set up the area and you're putting it around the different points, but then you go over a corner into someone else's private domain. That doesn't work, right? It can go around the private domain, but it can't go into it. In conclusion, and then we'll take more questions. In order to be able to construct an Eruv that would permit one to carry on Shabbat, one must first clarify that the area is under discussion is biblically a makom patur and not a reshut harabim. It is possible for the area not to be considered a public domain on a biblical level, either because it lacks a population of 600,000 people, because its main street does not go through the city, or because the buildings line the street, such as the case may be in a large city. Right? So those are your 3 main ways to de-publicize the area and turn it into a makom patur. Once the area is ascertained to be a Carmelite, which is a makom patur on a biblical level, it is possible to erect an Eruv using Tzurat HaPetach, this symbolic form of string going around the areas. Finally, even if a community has a properly constructed Eruv, its residents must ensure that they only use it in accordance with the rest of Hilchot Shabbat. So using your Eruv to go out and do your shopping does not work because it's Shabbat. You should not be doing shopping. And just because you have an Eruv which lets you bring home your shopping does not mean that you should be using it for such a prohibited activity. All right, so again, thank you to Rabbi Schachter for giving me the great summary, which allows me to take you guys through a lot of the ins and outs or ups and downs of how a modern Eruv gets built. But I know that you may still have lingering questions. And although it's exactly 8 o'clock and I'm amazed we finished right on time, I am open for additional questions that you may need to ask. Or have you all been stunned into silence by the complexities? You might say this is the kind of thing where don't try this at home is advised. Like I said, building an Eruv for a community of any size is not for the faint of heart. Maintaining an Eruv, just as one little aside, is also rather complicated. There will be inspectors who go out on a regular basis to make sure that the Eruv is still intact and that it is good. If there is a strong storm, usually people will assume the Eruv has been damaged and therefore wait until they have heard that it is okay. In some places, they have flag poles with a flag that goes up to let you know if the Eruv is okay. Other places have websites that let you know if the Eruv is okay. We still keep an eye on all of this. Once built, you still have to maintain it.
I got a question, Rabbi.
Yes.
How come in New York City they were able to get an Eruv constructed that would be accepted by almost all the Jewish people there when they have a huge Orthodox population?
Because life comes first.
Oh.
I mean, ultimately, that is one of the main issues, right? That the purpose of building an Eruv is to bring people together. And if there is a legitimate and reasonable reason to believe that it was not prohibited by the Torah, then using the rabbis to permit what the rabbis prohibited is something that our communities have done for most of the last 2,000 years. Because being able to carry from place to place on Shabbat is one of the hallmarks of being connected to other people. And that really is the ultimate lesson of Eruv. It's not about excluding. It's not about building a wall that pushes people out. It is always about building a wall that brings people in, that connects people together. And politics aside, generally speaking, most Eruvin have been successful at that. There is always a cranky minority that sometimes, annoyed, but most people, by and large, even from different factions, will find their own reason to accept an Eruv, even if it's not always a universal reason from different groups. To do otherwise is simply to cut yourself off. Alrighty then. Again, feel free to give a call or send an email if you have more questions, but we will stop it here for tonight. Take care, everyone. Be well. We will be starting with Mishnah Ta'anit next Wednesday. Mishnah Ta'anit. All right. Take care, and thank you for your patience in one of the more complicated Mishnahs that you're going to have to deal with. Eruv is considered to be a good place to break your brain, and you guys have toughed it out and gone through it. I promise Ta'anit is probably going to seem a little bit easier to deal with.
All right. Thanks, Rabbi.